Hello, High Point Church family, and those who are joining us as guests this week. If you're new with us and don't know who I am, my name is Cassie, and my husband Josh and I are the core officers or pastors here at High Point Community Church. Now, while we had hoped to be worshiping together in person by now, we obviously are still in our own homes worshiping apart. But we are thankful to God for the technology that makes it possible to worship in this way as we wait for the time when we can gather together safely again. We want everyone to stay safe and healthy, and so we believe that this is for the best right now. We know that God dwells among his people, and this means that we can experience his presence wherever we are, even if that means worshiping him from our couches. Now, I'd be lying though if I said that I wasn't disappointed that we find ourselves facing these extended health orders and restrictions. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of doing things online, and as I've said many times before, I miss being able to see you all and to greet you and be with you in our building. We are designed for community, and so I can't wait for the day when we can gather in our sanctuary and worship in person together. For now though, we will continue to worship in this way with our church at home services. Last week we did something a little bit different, and we celebrated the new year in a Zoom service online. But this is our first church at home service of 2021. And so today we're going to spend some time talking about this new year and looking at how we can intentionally seek God and experience his love and mercy in the coming days and months, even while we remain in isolation. Now, we know that 2020 was a long and hard year, and unfortunately, 2021 has yet to bring the relief that we are all seeking. While it's still really early and there is a lot of year left, it can be hard to find hope for a better year when we've started the year in isolation with news of rising COVID cases and civil unrest in the United States. We may be only 10 days in, but so far, things don't seem any better. So how do we fight the discouragement, and how do we process these mixed emotions that we face as we long for a better year, but recognize that there is still a lot of hard things going on around us? How do we find hope in 2021 if things don't get better soon? Well, I asked myself that question this week, and it led me to the book of Lamentations and to a beautiful and hopeful answer. So today we're going to do a few things. First, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the book of Lamentations, and we're going to see what this book has to say about suffering. We'll then reflect on our own suffering and process this together. Then we'll look at what Lamentations says about hope in the middle of sorrow, and we will talk about how this hope applies to our lives and how we can live as people of hope in 2021, regardless of what is to come. Sounds good? Great. Let's grab our Bibles and get started. If you have your Bible with you, I invite you to flip to Lamentations now. If you're not familiar with Lamentations, I really encourage you to read this book and study it. But I will warn you that it's a pretty difficult book because it deals with grief and suffering. It's a book of poetry, and this poetry expresses the deep sorrow of the Israelites as they experience war, starvation, slavery, and death at the hands of the Babylonians, who have taken over Jerusalem and led the people into exile. It is filled with strong language and several mentions of tears and crying as the people air their grievances against God. Now, while we don't have time to read the whole book this morning, I want you to know that all 5 chapters are filled with crying and sorrow and with complaints against God about what has happened to his people. This book does not spare God's feelings, but cries out honestly as the people reflect and remember the suffering they endured because of God's judgment. Now, as a side note, it's very important for me to note right now that suffering does not necessarily mean judgment. We all face sorrow of all kinds, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we've done something wrong and that God is punishing us. If we were to read the book of Job together, we would see the story of a righteous man who has done all the right things and honors God with his life. And yet, Job endures terrible suffering and loses everything. Sometimes suffering just doesn't make sense, and so we need to be careful to not assume that it is always caused because of wrongdoing or God's judgment. However, the Bible tells us that the suffering in Lamentations was caused by the judgment of God. The Israelites were not living as God's people. They were not keeping his law, and they were not honoring him with their lives. They were oppressing the weak and the marginalized. They were worshiping other gods, and they were not acting as God's people. And so, despite several warnings, God brings judgment down upon the people and allows the Babylonians to capture Jerusalem. The people have sinned greatly, and there are consequences. And these consequences are hard to endure. If we were to read chapters 1 to 3 of Lamentations, we would hear about starvation, about the loss of children, about an utter reversal from affluence to nothing. And we would hear the author of this book place the blame on God. Look with me for a moment at chapter 3, verses 1 to 18. Lamentations 3, 1 to 18. I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He turned aside my steps and tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. He drove into my kidney the arrow of his quiver. I have become the laughingstock of all peoples, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness and has sated me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me covered in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. There is no mincing of words here. This poem of sorrow is filled with strong language, and it paints a vivid picture of suffering and defeat. The poet claims that he has forgotten what happiness is, and that his endurance and hope has perished. He notes that he has seen affliction, and he believes that God has brought him under his wrath, that God has turned aside from him and has filled him with bitterness and pain. And while I hope that our realities have not been quite that awful, I'm sure we can relate somewhat to what is going on here. And if you've experienced grief or loss beyond the overall events of 2020, then you may resonate with these words on an even deeper level. Perhaps you have felt walled in or trapped, or maybe like God isn't hearing your prayers. Maybe you felt like you've been in a time of darkness without light. Maybe you've lost sight of peace, happiness, or hope. And maybe you've wondered where God is in all of this. Maybe you felt like he's let you down or has brought this pain upon you. And if you felt any of these things, then I want you to know that that's okay. We face big, hard emotions, and we need to be able to vent them, to process them, and get them out. We need to express what we are feeling, just as the poet in Lamentations expresses his sorrow and anger towards God. Friends, when we think about it, we have been through a lot. No, we have probably not been taken captive like the Israelites, and we may not face starvation or slavery or death, but we have been taken out of our church communities and our place of worship. We have mourned the loss of routine, of security, maybe of a job, of freedom to socialize and to gather with those we love. We have watched as justice has been challenged and people have been treated without the dignity and love that they are worthy of just by being human. We have witnessed violence and oppression and disease and natural disasters and more, all in the span of a year. And it's been a lot to take in. Our world has suffered, and it isn't over. We continue to experience the effects of COVID-19, and we continue to watch as hatred and division results in acts of chaos and violence. And so we cry out to God, and we, like the poet in Lamentations, say, Our endurance has perished, and so has our hope. We are left feeling tired and discouraged. But this expression of sorrow is not all that the poet in Lamentations has to say. Although the author of this book does express his sorrow and anger towards God, he doesn't stop there. He doesn't dwell on these hard feelings forever. If we keep reading Lamentations 3, we see that the poet is able to find hope despite all of his suffering and sorrow. Let's read and see where this hope is found. Look with me at Lamentations 3, 19 to 24. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. Here the poet admits that his soul is worn down because he is constantly remembering his affliction and his sorrow. But then, despite his constant sorrow, he states in verse 21 that he has hope. Why? Because he calls something to mind. Verse 22 tells us that the poet remembers the steadfast love of the Lord that never ceases, and that God's mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, and God's faithfulness is great. Despite his overwhelming sorrow, the poet reminds himself to think about the love and mercy and faithfulness of his God. He knows that despite how bad things may seem, God is a loving God with love that never stops or fails. And this loving God has new mercies each day. This means that the poet doesn't need to figure out how he will make it to the end of his sorrow. He just needs to get through the day, because God will give him the mercy and strength that he needs each morning. He knows that God is his portion, that God is enough for him. And so, despite all of the bad things that has happened, he can say, therefore, I will hope in him. By remembering the character of God, the author of Lamentations has gone from saying that his hope has perished to claiming that he will take hope in the Lord. And I pray that we can experience this shift as well. Friends, it can be really easy to focus on our suffering, to let our vision be clouded by everything that is going wrong around us. But if we constantly remember our sorrow, we don't have the space to remember the character of our God. When we feel overwhelmed and exhausted, we can and should express these feelings. But then we need to remind ourselves of who our God is. We need to call to mind his steadfast love, his mercy, and his faithfulness, because this is the only place where we can find hope. Yes, we can try and place our hope in 2021. We can hope for a better year. We can hope that COVID will end, justice will come, and we will no longer hear stories of violence or oppression. We can hope for better news headlines and for more time with those we love. And while we do hope that these things will come, there is no guarantee that any of them will happen. And so if we place our hope on these things alone, we may find ourselves very disappointed and in more sorrow than we were in 2020. But rather, we place our hope in Christ. Why? Because his mercies are new every morning, and he gives us what we need for each day. When we are discouraged or tired or overwhelmed, it can be hard to see past right now. And God knows that. He doesn't ask us to place all our hope in a distant future, but rather on his love and mercy for today. 2 Corinthians 12:9 tells us that God's grace is sufficient for us, and that he will be strong even in our weakness. God is enough, and his love and his faithfulness will never fail. If you are feeling worn down because of grief or sorrow, I want you to know that there is hope. During the Advent season, we learned that hope means that something good is coming because the future is in good hands. And recently, in my own study, I came across a similar definition of hope that I really love. It says that hope is the anticipation that God will do something good for me. Church, I want you to know that God will do something good. He loves you and He is faithful, and He has new mercies for you every day. So take hope and know that no matter what you may face, God is with you. He loves you, and He will give you what you need to get through today. As we prepare to wrap up this time of seeking God through His Word, I invite you to continue working through the Church at Home service and encourage you to take some time to reflect on what we've just learned together. After I finish speaking, I'd love for you to take a few moments and reread Lamentations 3, 1-18. And as you do, I encourage you to think through how you are feeling. And if you are feeling any grief or sorrow or uneasiness, then take a moment and express that honestly before the Lord. Tell Him how you are feeling. But then, after you've expressed your emotions, take a second to set those feelings aside and shift your thinking towards the character of God. Call His love, mercy, and His faithfulness to mind, and ask Him to show you the ways that He has provided for you today. Thank Him for giving us new mercies every day, and ask Him to sustain you until tomorrow, reminding you of His love and faithfulness towards you. As you do this, I pray that you are filled with hope, and that this hope will continue to sustain you through this coming year, whatever it may bring. And I pray that one day we will be together and we will have many stories to share of how God has been with us and He has filled us with His hope. Until then, be well and rest in the love and mercy of our great God and our source of all hope.